The world's attention has once again shifted toward the Middle East. Every time headlines mention missile strikes, drone attacks, or emergency military meetings, one country repeatedly appears at the center of the tension: Iran. But to understand what is truly happening, we need to step back from the breaking news cycle and examine the deeper strategic picture. Iran is not a minor regional actor. It is a nation of nearly 90 million people, positioned at one of the most critical geopolitical crossroads in the world. It borders the Persian Gulf, sits near the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of global oil supply passes, and maintains influence stretching from Lebanon to Yemen. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran has built its foreign policy around resistance to Western influence, particularly that of the United States, and opposition to Israel. This ideological foundation shapes nearly every strategic decision Tehran makes. Unlike many conventional powers, Iran does not rely solely on direct military confrontation. Instead, it has developed what analysts call a network strategy. Through alliances with non-state actors and regional militias, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militias in Iraq, forces in Syria, and the Houthis in Yemen, Iran has extended its reach far beyond its borders. This approach gives Iran strategic depth. It allows Tehran to project power indirectly while avoiding full-scale war. On the other side of this equation stands Israel, which views Iran's regional expansion and nuclear ambitions as existential threats. The United States, Israel's closest ally, maintains military bases across the region and has repeatedly stated that it will not allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. This triangular dynamic, Iran, Israel, and the United States, creates a fragile balance. For years, the confrontation has remained largely in the shadows. Cyber attacks, covert operations, targeted assassinations, and airstrikes on suspected weapons facilities. Analysts often refer to it as a shadow war. However, the danger lies in miscalculation. When actions move from covert operations to direct missile exchanges, the line between shadow conflict and open war begins to blur. And that is precisely the moment the world fears most. Because a direct war involving Iran would not remain regional for long. It would affect energy markets, global trade routes, financial systems, and possibly draw in additional powers. To understand how close we truly are to that scenario, we must examine three key questions. First, what triggered the current escalation? Second, how strong is Iran's actual military capability? And third, what are the realistic chances of a full-scale war? Let's begin with the first question. What triggered the escalation? To understand the current tensions, we must recognize that this conflict did not begin overnight. For years, Iran and Israel have been engaged in what experts describe as a prolonged shadow confrontation. This has included cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, sabotage operations, airstrikes on weapons convoys in Syria, and targeted assassinations of military and scientific figures. These actions were deliberate, calculated, and often deniable. But shadow conflicts are inherently unstable. They operate in a gray zone, below the threshold of full-scale war, yet constantly testing boundaries. In recent years, several developments have intensified the situation. First, Iran has significantly expanded its missile and drone capabilities. The country now possesses one of the largest ballistic missile arsenals in the Middle East. Its growing drone program has proven capable of long-range precision strikes. Second, Israel has increased the frequency of its operations, targeting Iranian assets in Syria and beyond. Israeli officials have repeatedly stated that they will not allow Iran to establish permanent military infrastructure near Israel's borders. Third, regional instability has multiplied the number of flashpoints. Conflicts involving proxy forces in Lebanon, Gaza, Iraq, and Yemen create constant opportunities for escalation. But escalation often begins with a specific event, a strike that crosses a psychological or political line. When high-ranking commanders are killed, when strategic facilities are hit, or when civilian casualties occur, leadership on both sides faces domestic pressure to respond. And response creates response. This is how limited exchanges can spiral. However, it is important to understand that both Iran and Israel are aware of the risks of uncontrolled escalation. Neither side appears eager for a full-scale conventional war. Instead, What we are witnessing is a calibrated contest of deterrence. Iran seeks to demonstrate that it can strike back and impose costs. Israel seeks to demonstrate that it can penetrate defenses and disrupt long-term threats. The United States, meanwhile, attempts to manage the escalation from a distance, reinforcing regional defenses, deploying naval assets, and signaling support without directly initiating war. This creates a delicate equilibrium. Each side pushes, but not too far. Each side retaliates, but attempts to avoid crossing what might trigger a broader regional conflict. The central danger is not deliberate war, it is miscalculation, a missile that lands in the wrong place, an attack that causes unexpected casualties, a political decision driven by domestic pressure rather than strategic patience. History shows that many wars begin not because they were planned, but because events move faster than diplomacy. Which brings us to the next critical issue. How powerful is Iran's military in reality? Is it capable of sustaining a large-scale conflict, or is its strength primarily psychological and asymmetric? How strong is Iran's military? Really, Iran's military power is often misunderstood. On paper, it does not resemble a conventional superpower. Its air force relies largely on aging aircraft, many dating back to before the 1979 revolution. Compared to the advanced fleets of Israel or the United States, Iran lacks technological parity in the skies. But judging Iran purely by traditional military standards misses the point. Iran's strategy has never been built around winning a classic head-to-head war. Instead, it has invested heavily in asymmetric capabilities, tools designed to offset technological disadvantages and impose high costs on stronger adversaries. The most significant element of this strategy is its missile program. Over the past 2 decades, Iran has developed a vast arsenal of short, medium, and potentially long-range ballistic missiles. Many of these are capable of reaching Israel and U.S. bases throughout the Middle East. Some are designed with improved accuracy and maneuverability, making interception more difficult. Then there are drones. Iran has become one of the leading producers of low-cost, long-range unmanned aerial vehicles. These systems allow Iran to project power without risking pilots, while also overwhelming air defense systems through sheer volume. But perhaps Iran's greatest strategic asset is not a weapon system. It is geography. Iran sits along the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in the global energy market. Roughly 20% of the world's oil shipments pass through this narrow waterway. In the event of a major conflict, even limited disruption to shipping in this area could cause dramatic spikes in global energy prices. That leverage matters. In addition to missiles and geography, Iran has built what could be described as a regional security buffer through allied militias and proxy forces. Hezbollah in Lebanon possesses tens of thousands of rockets. Armed groups in Iraq have targeted U.S. installations. The Houthis in Yemen have demonstrated the ability to strike shipping routes and regional infrastructure. This network creates multiple fronts. Any large-scale conflict involving Iran would not likely remain confined to one battlefield. It could extend across borders, pulling in several theaters simultaneously. However, there are clear limitations. Iran's economy is under heavy sanctions. Its air force lacks modern fighter jets compared to Israel's F-35 fleet. Its naval forces cannot match the U.S. Navy in open confrontation. In a prolonged, high-intensity conventional war, Iran would face significant challenges, which is precisely why its doctrine focuses on deterrence, attrition, and cost imposition rather than rapid victory. The message embedded in Iran's military posture is simple. If attacked, the conflict will be painful for everyone. But the question that truly worries global leaders is not just about missiles or drones. It is about nuclear capability. Because conventional deterrence is one thing. Nuclear deterrence changes the equation entirely. The nuclear question: no issue shapes the Iran conflict more than its nuclear program. Officially, Iran insists that its nuclear activities are peaceful, focused on civilian energy production and scientific development. Tehran repeatedly states that it does not seek nuclear weapons and that such weapons contradict its religious doctrine. However, the international community remains skeptical. Over the past 2 decades, Iran has expanded its uranium enrichment capabilities. Enrichment itself is not illegal under international law if conducted under proper monitoring. But the level of enrichment matters. Low-level enrichment can fuel nuclear power plants. High-level enrichment, particularly above 60% purity, dramatically shortens the technical distance to weapons-grade material. Many analysts now describe Iran as a threshold state. This means Iran may not currently possess a nuclear bomb, but it potentially has the knowledge, infrastructure, and enriched material that could allow it to build one if a political decision were made. And that distinction is critical, because in strategic terms, the ability to rapidly build a weapon can function as a form of deterrence even if no weapon officially exists. Israel has made its position clear for decades. It will not allow Iran to become a nuclear-armed state. This policy is rooted in existential concern. Israel is geographically small, and its leaders have consistently stated that even the possibility of a hostile nuclear power in the region is unacceptable. The United States shares that concern, though Washington has historically favored diplomatic solutions when possible. In 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, often referred to as the Iran nuclear deal, placed strict limits on Iran's enrichment levels and allowed international inspections in exchange for sanctions relief. But after the United States withdrew from the agreement in 2018, tensions rose again. Iran gradually reduced compliance with the deal's restrictions, increasing enrichment levels and limiting inspection access. Since then, negotiations have stalled. This leaves the world in a strategic gray zone. Iran does not officially have a nuclear weapon. Israel believes it cannot risk allowing Iran to reach that point. The United States aims to prevent escalation, but also maintain deterrence. The danger lies in timing. If Israel were to conclude that Iran is approaching weaponization, it might consider a preventive strike on nuclear facilities. Such a strike would almost certainly trigger retaliation. And retaliation could ignite the broader regional war that all sides claim to want to avoid. The nuclear issue is not just about weapons. It is about trust, perception, and red lines. When leaders begin to believe that time is running out, decisions become more aggressive. And that brings us to the next major question. If conflict were to expand, would the United States directly enter the war? Would the United States enter the war? The United States plays a complex and carefully calibrated role in this conflict. On one hand, Washington has repeatedly reaffirmed its commitment to Israel's security. American military aid, intelligence cooperation, and missile defense coordination between the two countries are deeply integrated. On the other hand, the United States has little strategic appetite for another large-scale war in the Middle East. After 2 decades of costly conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, American policymakers are acutely aware of the financial, political, and human costs of prolonged military engagements in the region. So where does that leave the United States? In a position of deterrence, but cautious deterrence. The U.S. maintains thousands of troops across the Middle East, including in Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, Qatar, and Bahrain. The U.S. Navy regularly deploys aircraft carriers and destroyers in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. Advanced missile defense systems are positioned to protect American bases and allied infrastructure. This presence serves 2 purposes. First, it signals to Iran that direct attacks on U.S. forces would trigger a response. Second, it reassures regional allies that Washington remains engaged. However, there is an important distinction between deterrence and initiation. The United States is unlikely to initiate a direct war with Iran unless one of several scenarios occurs. If American troops are killed in large numbers, if Iran directly attacks U.S. territory or major strategic assets, or if Israel faces an existential threat requiring immediate intervention. Even then, the response might be limited. Precision strikes, cyber operations, or targeted campaigns, rather than full invasion. Another factor shaping U.S. decision-making is global strategy. Washington is simultaneously managing tensions with China in the Indo-Pacific and confronting Russia in Europe. Opening a third major front would stretch resources and political capital. Therefore, the American approach appears to focus on containment rather than escalation. Support Israel. Deter Iran. Avoid direct war if possible. But conflict does not always unfold according to plan. In a rapidly escalating crisis, for example, if missile exchanges expand dramatically, the United States could be drawn in not by choice, but by obligation. This is the risk of alliance structures. When partners are attacked, neutrality becomes politically difficult. And that raises another important question. If the conflict expands, will it remain confined to Iran and Israel, or could other regional powers become involved? Could other countries be pulled in? If a broader conflict were to erupt, it is unlikely to remain limited to just Iran and Israel. The Middle East is a region of overlapping alliances, rivalries, and fragile balances of power. A direct war would create ripple effects across multiple borders. Let's begin with Lebanon. Hezbollah, one of Iran's most powerful allies, possesses a vast arsenal of rockets and missiles. In the event of a large-scale confrontation between Israel and Iran, Hezbollah could open a northern front against Israel. That alone would dramatically escalate the conflict and stretch Israel's military resources. Then there is Iraq. Several armed groups in Iraq maintain close ties to Tehran. In previous crises, these groups have launched attacks against U.S. military facilities. If tensions rise sharply, American bases in Iraq and Syria could once again become targets. In Yemen, the Houthis have already demonstrated the ability to strike regional shipping routes and energy infrastructure. Expanded conflict could threaten maritime trade in both the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. What about the Gulf states? Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have complex relationships with Iran. While they view Tehran as a strategic rival, they also fear regional instability. A full-scale war would threaten oil infrastructure, investor confidence, and economic diversification plans. As a result, many regional governments are likely to prioritize de-escalation rather than direct involvement. And what about larger powers outside the region? Russia and China both maintain diplomatic and economic ties with Iran. However, neither appears eager to become militarily entangled in a regional war. Their likely role would focus on diplomacy, economic positioning, and strategic advantage rather than direct combat. One frequently asked question concerns Pakistan. Despite religious and geographic proximity, Pakistan is unlikely to directly intervene on Iran's behalf. Islamabad faces its own domestic challenges and maintains delicate diplomatic relations with Gulf states and the West. In short, most countries would prefer to avoid direct participation. But wars have a way of widening unintentionally. If missile strikes hit foreign military bases, if oil infrastructure is severely damaged, if global shipping lanes are blocked, external actors may feel compelled to respond. Which brings us to a crucial dimension often overlooked in military analysis, the economic consequences. Because even before a single additional country fires a shot, global markets would react immediately, and those reactions could reshape the conflict's political calculations. The global economic impact. If a large-scale conflict involving Iran were to erupt, the first shock would not necessarily be military. It would be economic. Markets react faster than armies move. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most strategically sensitive waterways in the world. Nearly one-fifth of global oil consumption flows through this narrow passage. Even the perception of disruption can send energy prices sharply higher. In previous regional crises, oil prices have spiked within hours of breaking news. A sustained conflict could push prices significantly upward, increasing transportation costs, raising inflationary pressure, and straining economies already dealing with debt and slow growth. And energy is only the first layer. Shipping routes through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf are critical to global trade. If maritime traffic were threatened by missile or drone attacks, insurance costs would rise dramatically. Some shipping companies might reroute vessels, increasing delivery times and supply chain expenses. Financial markets would likely respond with volatility. Investors typically move capital into so-called safe haven assets during geopolitical crises: gold, U.S. Treasury bonds, and certain currencies. Stock markets, particularly in energy-importing countries, could face downward pressure. Emerging markets would be especially vulnerable. Higher oil prices can benefit energy exporters, but they can severely damage countries dependent on imports. Currency instability, rising food costs, and public unrest can follow. This is why global powers watch the region so closely. Even countries geographically distant from the Middle East would feel the consequences. There is also a long-term strategic dimension. If instability became prolonged, Countries might accelerate diversification of energy sources, reshape supply chains, and reconsider regional security partnerships. In other words, the impact would extend far beyond the battlefield. Which leads to the central question many viewers are asking: how likely is a full-scale war? Is this simply another cycle of escalation and deterrence, or are we approaching a breaking point? How likely is a full-scale war? So after examining the military balance, the nuclear question, regional alliances, and economic consequences, we arrive at the most important issue. How likely is a full-scale war between Iran and Israel, potentially involving the United States? The honest answer is complex. On one hand, the risk is real. The number of flashpoints has increased. Military exchanges are becoming more direct. Political rhetoric on all sides has hardened. When tensions rise to this level, the margin for error narrows dramatically. And history shows that wars often begin not because leaders desire them, but because events outpace control. A missile misfires. An air defense system fails. Civilian casualties change public opinion overnight. Under intense domestic pressure, governments may respond more forcefully than originally intended. However, there is another side to this equation. All major actors understand the cost of full-scale war. For Iran, a direct confrontation with Israel and potentially the United States would risk severe damage to infrastructure and further economic isolation. For Israel, a multi-front war involving Hezbollah and other regional actors would strain its defense systems and civilian resilience. For the United States, a new Middle Eastern war would carry political and financial consequences at a time of global strategic competition elsewhere. This mutual awareness creates deterrence. In many ways, what we are witnessing is a controlled confrontation, a dangerous but calculated exchange of signals. Each side demonstrates capability. Each side reinforces red lines. But each also appears to stop short of total escalation. The situation resembles a high-stakes game of brinkmanship. The danger lies not in intention, but in misjudgment. If leaders misinterpret signals, if intelligence assessments prove wrong, if one side believes that waiting increases risk, the balance could shift quickly. For now, diplomacy continues quietly behind the scenes. Back-channel communications, international mediators, and strategic messaging all work to prevent the conflict from crossing into uncontrollable territory. But stability in such an environment is fragile. The Middle East has experienced cycles of escalation before. Many have stopped short of full war. The critical question is whether the current cycle follows the same pattern or whether it becomes something larger. In geopolitics, perception shapes reality. And right now, all sides are calculating not only their capabilities, but their timing. The world watches closely, because the difference between deterrence and war is often just one decision.